My name's Betsy Griffin, and I work at the John N. Gardner Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education. A real mouthful. I didn't name it, but we do a variety of things related to helping institutions figure out how to improve student success. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the recommendations that have come out of a process that we facilitate with institutions who want to improve the success of transfer on their campus. So I wanted to talk about what we see in terms of the top recommendations coming out of those institutional plans, and maybe some of those recommendations will touch on areas that you might want to look at your institution and think about whether or not that would be a concern for you, and if you should get a plan to do something about at least some of the things that other institutions have identified. So that's the idea behind this session. And we have some institutional representatives in here who are going to be talked about because they're part of the institutions who are included in the analysis of these plans. So anytime you want to, even though we're in this big, huge place, please feel free to ask a question or comment. I had hoped to get some more feedback as we go. I'm not sure it's going to work too well in here from you about what you're doing to address some of the issues that institutions have identified. So these are the three key things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some of the key questions, and if you, these might be questions that you would want to go back and think about on your campus. And I'll talk a little bit about the background of Foundations of Excellence. That's the process that the institutions have used to come up with these recommendations. And then the main part is all of the recommendations from 2- and 4-year institutions from which I had plans available and were able to analyze. So that's the key. So first of all, do you have a structured plan on your campus to improve transfer? I know these folks in the front do because they just developed one. Anybody else have a structured plan to improve transfer? No? Okay. So, you know, if you don't have a plan, these are some of the reasons why you might think about getting a plan. If you were in Dave's session this morning, first thing, you heard some of the transfer numbers and the fact that so many students are transferring in different kind of ways, from 2-year to 4-year, from 4-year to 2-year, from 4 to 2, 4 to 4, and all of those kinds of things. So transfer has really become the new majority. It's what happens with many students. They transfer once, twice, 3, 5 times sometimes, but we won't get into that. And most institutions, most 4-year institutions, were designed to work with incoming new first-year students and take them through the pathway. 2-year institutions, while many of them were initially conceived as transfer institutions, kind of got morphed into more of a workforce development kind of focus as a major focus. So both on the 2-year and 4-year side, we often aren't really set up for transfer. And the approach to transfer is therefore very decentralized on a lot of campuses. On 4-year campuses, it may reside in the various colleges and schools. It may reside in some centralized places, some decentralized places. It may just reside in a whole variety of different units on campus. What happens when a process is so disaggregated is that there are lots of gaps and holes in services and approaches. There are lots of things that may be being duplicated in different ways across a single institution. So that's why you might want to consider everything you're doing and have a plan. So here are some of the things that I think are key questions. And these are questions you could go back at your institution and think about and get together some folks and talk about, what do people on your campus know about your transfer or transfer-bound students? If you're to your campus and you're preparing students to transfer, your transfer-bound students, do you know who they are? Do you know how many you have? Do you know what their characteristics are, where they're going? All of those kinds of things. If you're a four-year campus, do you actually know how many people are coming in as transfers, what their characteristics are, what their academic background is? All of these kinds of things that are important. And probably many of you know because you are the transfer experts on your campus. But who else on your campus knows these characteristics about transfer? So if we think about, that's a very fundamental kind of question to consider. What are you currently doing for transfer students? What kind of supports are in place to help them through this process, to help them adjust to a new campus at a four-year institution, to help them plan for their pathway and make sure that they're moving ahead at a two-year institution. So what kind of academic programs have the greatest number of transfer students? This is a critical question if you're thinking about aligning the curriculum. You want to make sure that those programs that have a great number of transfer students have the best pathways in and out of your institution. So knowing that is critical. What are your primary sending and receiving institutions, depending on your position? And you probably know maybe the top one or two. You may not know what the next in line are down the road, but these are the partners that you need to strengthen relationships with, have good agreements with, etc. So those are things to know about. Institutional policies. You have lots of institutional policies that impact transfers. Some of them in really negative ways, potentially. Some of them are very facilitative. So what are your policies and what effects are they having on transfer success? Who on your campus are the transfer advocates? It may be an official role on your campus. It may be a transfer advocates who the students know about. It may be transfer advocates that are really behind the scene advocating for effective policies and new programs to serve transfer students. So, who are those key people? What do the faculty and staff in general know about transfer? Faculty are critical. Often they don't know very much about transfer at your institution. They teach their courses, they do a great job, they do their research, they do a great job with that. But what do they know about the transfer issues? And Where do your students go for information? How do they get the information they need for transfer at your institution? So these are some things you can think about, take back with you as potential questions to get together a group of people and ask about transfer. These are some of the questions that you would have seen if you had done our process, along with a whole bunch of others, right? So I'm pointing out some of our Central Florida partners who recently looked at transfer on their institution. Again, something they've been doing for decades, but it just did it again for a new approach. And the process that they used and that all of the recommendations I'm talking about today come from a structured process that we call Foundations of Excellence Transfer. It's a process that leads to a self-study, kind of like you would do for an accreditation, except that it doesn't have that kind of weight, but it should lead to a plan that you can implement on your campus and improve transfer. So Foundations of Excellence Transfer is an institution-wide self-study. It looks at everything that you do at your institution for transfer. And it results in an action plan, which then you need to implement to have the impact on transfer student success. At four-year institutions, the approach of Foundations of Excellence is aimed at incoming transfer students. What are you doing to help those students, particularly in the first year of transfer at your institution, to be successful and then just become a regular UCF student or whatever fits at your institution. So at two-year institutions, when we were designing the process, we had a team of experts from 2- and 4-year institutions helping us to design. And we thought about, well, 2-year institutions send transfer students, they receive transfer students. What can we focus on? And we were counseled that we couldn't focus on both. So we focused on the sending part, the preparation of students to transfer. So we talk about transfer-bound students in the 2-year process. We know that 2-year institutions get a lot of transfers, but it just is too complicated to look at both ends of the spectrum at the same time. So we're looking at that pathway. If you did this kind of a self-study, it starts with a set of standards. We call those standards foundational dimensions, and hopefully you got a brochure that has those dimensions in it. If you didn't, I think I brought a stack of 100, and I didn't expect to use them all here. Those dimensions are listed on our website, jngi.org, and you're free to use them any way you would like to use them on your institution. You don't have to work with us to use those foundational dimensions. They give you a set of standards that are aspirational in nature, that you can see where your institution measures up. In the process to help guide that, we include a lot of performance indicators associated with those foundational dimensions. One of the first starting points of this evidence-based process is an inventory, and it's an inventory of student data, a fairly rich look at the transfer students at your institution, their background characteristics, demographics, academic characteristics, the kinds of academic experiences they're bringing to you, whether they're full-time, part-time, on the four-year side, GPAs, whether they got an associate's degree or didn't before they came to you, and all those kind of things. On the two-year side, a number of entering characteristics for academic background as well. So that kind of data we think is really important. It's important to have data to inform your decision making, and this is important data that is shared with everybody on your task force, with anybody at your institution that you want to know more about transfers. A lot of the data that is included in the inventory might be known by your IR staff and your administrators at the top level, but a lot of other people on your campus who should know about transfers don't know what that data is. The inventory also includes some things about the institution's policies, programs, committees, other kinds of institutional structures that isn't based on student data. There are surveys involved that help give some student and faculty staff perceptions. Any other kind of institution data or reports that an institution wants to use, they should. We highly encourage that. The most important driver of this self-study kind of process is a task force of stakeholders. It should be very broad and big. It usually is over 100 people on a particular campus. It involves faculty, staff, from academic support, from student services. It involves students. In the transfer process, it very often and should involve some of those transfer partners from sending and receiving institutions, so that you can get all the kinds of perspectives that you need as you evaluate the institution on the dimensions, come up with recommendations for improvements, and then end up with a final plan to improve transfers. So that, in a nutshell, is really the process that the institutions whose recommendations I'm going to talk about in just a second have come up with. And the whole thing is to develop a plan that's going to be effective to improve transfer student success. And it's those plans that we have recommendations. So here are the 9 institutions that I've included from the four-year side in this analysis. I know you can't read those, but I have 24 two-year institutions, and if you can read them, you'll notice that quite a few of them are from Kentucky, because the Kentucky Community and Technical College system had all 16 of their institutions look at transfer at the same time. So there are a lot of Kentucky institutions, but there are two-year institutions from other places included. But about 2/3 of the two-year institutions are Kentucky. So in the sort of qualitative analysis that I did, I categorized all the recommendations on both sides at different levels. So this is the kind of top level of themes that come up in the analysis. And these are organized on this particular slide in terms of the number of institutions that made recommendations. So number one is the highest number of institutions. Sometimes there are 2 or 3 recommendations that fall into the same theme from a single institution. So, but as you're perusing that list, and I'm going to go into more depth about this kind of sub-themes under those themes in a minute, you can see that actually they're in a little bit different order for 2- and 4-year institutions, but the top 6 themes really are the same. So my next slide is the next 5 of, so you can have what the top 10 themes are, and I'm going to talk about in depth some of the more particulars associated with those themes. So you can see in the top 10 there's a little bit of a difference, but a lot of commonality of the areas targeted by 2- and 4-year institutions. The specific recommendations become a little bit different for the 2 types of institutions. So advising comes out pretty near the top. It's the top on the 2-year side, and near the top, it's the number 4 on the 4-year side. And almost 2/3 of the institutions that had recommendations about advising thought they needed to do better professional development for advisors around transfer. They needed to provide advisors better information about specific elements of transfer on their campus, their articulation agreements, how courses transfer, et cetera. They needed to provide advisors better information about transfer in general, transfer issues, et cetera. So that comes out as sort of the predominant theme for advising. Next, improving the advising materials, making sure that advisors had access to up-to-date information, providing checklists relative to transfer pathways, other kinds of things, developing advising handbooks just for transfer advising. So making sure that the advisors have good materials available to them. Assessing advising, making sure that it is effective for the transfer students is another one of those. Requiring or encouraging advisement. Not every institution requires students planning to transfer or students transferring in to have an advising session. So that's a big recommendation. And having advisors, not just every advisor can advise transfers. You have specialized advisors with specialized knowledge and training to work with transfer students. Now, what I didn't say when I first started this slide, and I apologize for, is that I didn't differentiate here between 2- and 4-year institutions because these were top issues at both types of institutions. So on some of my slides, I differentiate particular things that 2-year institutions or 4-year institutions have said. And on the next advising slide, for 2-year or for 4-year institutions, one of the advising elements is getting better communication between academic programs, academic departments, where the transfer students are going, and the advisors. who may be in a central advising office. So that's a particular four-year institution with advising. At the two-year institution, there were more recommendations about the organization of advising, creating a central advising place, having a coordinator for advising, because very often the advising is a faculty function that's scattered throughout the programs. And revising the advising process. I didn't see this on the four-year side, but a number of the institutions on the two-year side wanted to change the way they advise. They developed an advising syllabus. They instituted master advisors. They did a number of things to just change the approach that they were using to advising as a whole. So those are some of the key things to think about. But advising for transfers is really critical, and it's not surprising that that comes up very often. Communication to students, this was number 2 on the list for both 2- and 4-year institutions. Again, some kind of common themes. And transfer is a moving target. Those transfer articulation agreements, courses, programs change. It's something that is difficult, so many of the institutions looking found that they either had out-of-date materials or really had a struggle to maintain materials that were up to date. So when students were looking at the transfer information, they weren't looking at old news that no longer applied. So that is an important key at both institutions, since both institutions, the 2- and the 4-year partners, are providing information about articulations, about course equivalencies, et cetera. It's really important to have a strategy to make sure that's continually updated and communicated effectively. Increasing the accessibility of transfer information on the web. I remember one of the student panels a couple of years ago at this conference, the students all said their number 1 go-to place was the institution website for transfer information. And a number of institutions, both the 2- and 4-year side, have recommendations to make that information more accessible. Put a button or a transfer button on the front page, or link to transfer information right up front. Consolidate a lot of times the transfer information. Students had to go to 5 or 6 different pages to get all the information they needed, so get it consolidated. Those are the kinds of things that you see from that information. Just making the accessibility of course equivalency information and articulation agreements, whether that's connecting it to the web page or making some central location that students can get that information. So these were the common themes from the 2- and 4-year institutions that I saw over and over. 2-year institutions were more likely to, really both of these speak to having multiple kinds of avenues to get information about transfer, to connect students who are intending to transfer with each other, with their transfer institutions. So a lot of interest in developing social media so that students know more about transfer, to include transfer information, not just on the website, but in a lot of different publications at the 2-year institution. For the 4-year institutions, one of the themes that come out is more about what kind of information they wanted to provide students, and that was to make students more aware of the institutional policies at their new institution, and to make students more aware of the differences or potential differences in expectations for students at their institution. The other thing is for four-year institutions, encouraging programs, departments, and schools to have their own better communication strategies for transfer students, so that the program-specific information that students are seeking is readily available and consistent, maybe on department websites or program websites, or in other ways. It was more from the perspective of, we think our students don't know about these policies, about registration policies, about program-specific policies, some of those kind of things, rather than coming from the students, but identified by the task force. I see Jenny shaking her head. If you got a comment you could add? No? Sometimes at a four-year institutions, there's sort of that myth that, well, these are already savvy college students because they've been at another institution, but things are different. And that's what we want to talk about. Assessment and data, while there's a lot of similarities on these assessment themes, because you're dealing with a different receiving versus sending, there are differences in sort of the twist, maybe similar themes, but with a different twist. So increasing the assessment of transfer students was one of the themes at the four-year institution, so you can better understand the students coming to you and provide the services that they need. That we see that. Disseminating the transfer student profile and student success rate, so that faculty and staff across the institution understand the kinds of transfer students that they are getting and the success. And again, that speaks in some cases to myth busting. There is that sort of negative myth about transfer students not being as successful, when oftentimes they are. So making sure that people understand what's going on. Assessing transfer program effectiveness. If you've got a number of transfer programs on your campus, and this could apply to both the two and the four-year institutions, are they working? And are you assessing them and making improvements as you go along? So that is a theme I saw a lot. And sharing the transfer student success data back with the sending institution. And again, my ordering is a little bit, this comes up a little less frequently at the four-year institutions than the ones that were listed higher on my slide, but it's still there, making sure you get that information back. I point that out because you can see the number one on the assessment side is on the two-year institutions is getting data from the four-year institutions about student success rates. And this goes down to even, program course level information, so that the two-year faculty can make their courses better fit. If they find out that students aren't doing well in an area after they transfer, they want to know that. And so that comes up as a really high desire from the two-year institutions. And it did come up on the four-year side, not quite as frequently. Tracking transfer students, these are transfer-bound students. So one of the, and I'm going to kind of blend this together with the next point. So at the two-year institution, the desire is to track them from early, at the time at the two-year institution, to and post-transfer. Primary transfer tracking has often just relied on clearinghouse data, but to have more specific data than's available there is one of the things that the institutions wanted to have. A lot of the two-year institutions that we've worked with in this process, and there are 33 in total, have, when they started the process, had no way to really identify. They didn't know who their transfer-bound students were. Who are our transfer? So identifying transfer-bound students early so that they can provide resources was one of the things we see coming out frequently. If you identify at one of the institutions I worked with, had it as an added feature to advising. First, advising for entering students, identify the transfer intent, and then every advising session afterwards, check on transfer intent again because it changes. So that's one of those kind of things. You can't really know if you're serving transfer-bound students if you don't know who they are, and they're not always the usual suspects. Not all students who intend to transfer enter into the AA program track. It's traditionally the transfer track. Some of them enter into the AAS track and they intend to transfer. Some of them come in even at a certificate level and they intend to transfer. So, identifying those students early is an important issue. And then disseminating that data, again, this point's very similar, letting people on campus know who their transfer-bound students are and the characteristics and where they're going, et cetera, so they can work more effectively with them. Collaboration with partners. I just have one slide here, and well, no, maybe I have two slides. Encouraging relationships between faculty and staff and their counterparts. Oftentimes, admissions counselors and maybe advisors are the only people that really have that kind of relationship, but making sure to expand those, including faculty and staff, increasing those. That was a number one theme with the two-year institutions and like the number two theme with the four-year institution. And expanding on or improving the agreements and the 2+2 programs and those kind of things is important work with transfer partners on both sides. Two-year institutions, understanding the success, all right, that's kind of the same point I just made, and increasing student contact with the receiving institution. And one of that is opening an office and having people from the four-year partners on campus as advisors, financial aid personnel, doing events with the transfer partners coming to campus, being at a transfer fair or other kind of events for transfer, arranging for visits to the four-year campus with the two-year students. So a lot of that takes collaboration to pull off, and that was a high thing. Working on curricular alignment came up a little more frequently on the four-year side, but that was kind of an underlying theme of the understanding student success after transfer on the two-year side. So it's not that it just comes out in kind of a different way, I think. It's very frequent that as these projects go forward, institutions come up with a way to change their organization around transfer, since it is often so dispersed. And you can see these are basically the same, but a little bit different in that the number one approach at the four-year institutions in terms of their recommendations is to add a transfer advisory board or a transfer council so that they can get people, stakeholders from different areas of the institution overseeing and having input into transfer. At the two-year side, the number one was to develop a transfer center, so there'd be a central place for students to come and for faculty and staff to get information about transfer and to, in some cases, house their transfer partners when they were on campus. So, you know, both types of institutions wanted to establish committees, or maybe to more centralize their office approach, but it was a little bit different with the organization. Philosophy, I think probably our foundational dimensions drive recommendations about philosophy, because one of the dimensions is, do you have a philosophy or rationale behind what you're doing for transfer? And so to create a transfer philosophy statement that can help guide programming and policy and approaches to transfer, and to disseminate that transfer philosophy comes out of many of the studies. My example on the bottom of this slide is a transfer philosophy from Big Sandy, which is one of my Kentucky community colleges, and you know, align degree offerings and to create pathways for students to enhance their opportunities to transfer. So the transfer philosophy makes some commitments around transfer. My example on the four-year side is IUPUI's transfer philosophy, and I know it's kind of hard to read there, but have developmentally appropriate support for transfer, intentionally connect transfer students to high quality programming, learning experiences, et cetera. So coming up with a kind of a philosophy or rationale that states some institutional commitment associated with transfer is one of the things that we see. Professional development, I already talked about, that was the number one advisor recommendation, so providing professional development to advisors in terms of agreements, tools for advising, general information, professional development for faculty and staff around transfer, for transfer student data sharing, dissemination of data, trends and issues about transfer, services, programs. A lot of faculty and staff don't know what is available on their campuses for transfer, so providing that sort of professional development comes up fairly frequently. And orientation, doing something different with orientation. The two-year side, a lot of institutions made recommendations about getting that transfer, intent to transfer. Are you going to transfer? What can you do if you're going to transfer information up front? Put it in orientation when students are coming to campus initially. And another kind of theme is using orientation as one place to start identifying students who are interested in transfer. On the four-year side, looking at the current transfer orientation programming, if it exists, and assessing it, making improvements in it, making more connections in orientation program with the schools, the academic schools, making it mandatory. A lot of four-year institutions don't really make transfer students come to orientation. So that would be that part. Final thoughts here. These are some areas you might consider for improvement. Improvement plans on any institution needs to be unique, but these are just some places to look. Each plan has to fit its own institutional context, which is why you need to involve a lot of people from the institution in thinking about developing a plan. And if you have a plan, you have to implement it. And if you're going to implement it, you have to continue to include a broad number of people. I mentioned early, we think that broad task force is critical, and it needs to be there going forward. And to some extent, some of the transfer councils are part of this idea of keeping that broad involvement as you're implementing and continuing to improve transfer. So those are my final thoughts, and I think I am within 1 minute of my time limit. So thank you very much for coming. If you've got any questions or thoughts you want to share with me later, please do. I have a table out front that has some materials on it. You're happy to stop by and pick up things. If I'm around, talk to me, although I'll be attending sessions most of the time, but I'll stop by the table. So thank you.